I had this idea at Tassajara, 1983, to start this women's practice center. But when I was thinking about where it actually, what the origin of it was, I feel like it goes back a little bit further. And so I want to start with when I was 3 years old. My mother had to take us to church with her. We were Catholics, and so Catholics have to go to church on Sunday. And she couldn't always find a babysitter for us. And my father was away because maybe I was older than 3, but it was during the Korean War. And so he was away in the army. And so she would take us to church with her, and she sat me down next to her, and she would hold my hand. And it made me love church. I loved my mother. And then, so I loved going to church from the time I was a little kid. And when I was in kindergarten, I went to Catholic schools. The priest came, the pastor of our parish came and talked to us one day. And our teacher asked him, could you tell us what your life is like? So he explained what his life was like. I don't remember anything that he said, but at the end he said, is there anyone, would any one of you, do you think you'd like to become a priest? And I was the only one in my kindergarten class that raised her hand. And of course they laughed and they said, oh no, you can't be a priest because you're a girl. Girls have to be nuns. So I'm like, okay, I'll be a nun then. And so that's what I always wanted to do from the time I was 5 years old. And when I talked to teachers about it, they always said, oh no, you're too much of an extrovert, and extroverts, you're too bubbly, you shouldn't be a nun. So I stopped telling them. So finally, after high school, I went to the convent, and it didn't work out. And when I left the convent, I was on the airplane. I went to the convent in South Dakota. I'm from Minnesota, but I went to the convent in a small place in South Dakota, and that's a whole nother story how I got to South Dakota. But I was on an airplane from a cornfield in South Dakota to the big city of Sioux Falls. And I remember looking out the window and thinking, I'm going to start my own convent. And I immediately dismissed that idea. I thought, oh no, I'm in no way qualified to do this. What am I thinking? This is just pure arrogance. But once Great Tree got started, once we got started on it, I realized that that came from someplace. I don't even know where. And it's the same place that my vision for Great Tree came from. I don't know where. It just, people say it was a dream, but it wasn't really, it's not really like a dream. Like, I want to start this place. It was like, I have to start this, And part of my reason for wanting to start Great Tree had to do with the fact that I felt that somehow we women, myself particularly, were not being clear enough about our insights that we were able to express them in a way that they were heard. When I came to North Carolina, when I came to Asheville, Zen Center of Asheville kind of started because I was here. There weren't a lot of Buddhist teachers. There weren't any Buddhist teachers here. There was one person who was teaching on behalf of Sherry Huber, and I was sitting with him. I had no intention of starting a Zen center, but the Zen center kind of started. People would say, oh, can we have morning meditation? Can we have family meditation? Can we have Dogen study group? And we were meeting all over the place. And finally, someone said, I'm going to buy a piece of property and I can rent it to you for the Zen Center. So, and then a lawyer came along and said, I want to put Buddhism on the map. So would you like to become legal? Like, yeah, that would make the finances easier. So Zen Center of Asheville kind of started, and I lived there for 7 or 8 years. And finally, for various things, I said, you know, what I really want to do is I really want to start this women's residential center. So, and almost all my students at Zen Center of Asheville were men. So the guys were saying, well, why would you want to do this? Because all your students are men. And I was like, but one of the things that I thought from the very beginning in thinking about this women's practice center was, I don't want to define it. There's enough definition in my experience of Zen. There's the basic forms, which to me is like a dance. And that's all we need. Just the basic forms so that we're all kind of moving together, bowing together, and sitting together. So Great Tree started with some pretty basic forms, but in the years between 1983, when I had the idea, and 2003, when we became a 501c3 church, I didn't realize it, but lots of ideas about what I thought it would be were there. How I thought it would become. All those things were there. So when I was thinking about this talk, I was thinking about how I really didn't want to give Great Tree a lot of definition. I didn't want to overlay a system of thinking on the practice here. I just wanted to come together and follow some of the forms, because that's what keeps the group kind of dancing together, and not have some idea about what that meant. And yet, as it evolved, as it fell apart, came together, fell apart, came together, didn't meet my expectations of what I wanted, and I thought I was a failure. Every single time that happened, I started to realize that this was an opportunity to let go of some fixed idea that I had and embrace what was actually happening, and recognize the potential of what was actually happening. I think from the time we're very young, I sometimes talk about my nephews, that my brother was 17 years younger than me, so he started having kids when, I was old enough to be a grandmother. So these particular nephews were very young, and so I kind of did a grandmotherly thing with them, and followed them from the time they were very young. And I talked to them on the phone, and they came and visited me in North Carolina with my brother and my sister-in-law. So I got to know them, and I watched them, and I used to have long conversations with them on the phone. And what I noticed is that when my older nephew was about 6 and he started to go to school, all of a sudden when I talked to him, when I would say something, he would pause for a moment and he would say, is that like, and he'd compare it to something that he already knew. And then the younger one would be put on the phone, and he was 4. And I would have a conversation with him, and I'd say something, and he'd go off on another tangent. He was completely in stream of consciousness thinking. So you couldn't have that kind of logical conversation with him like you could with the older one. And I realized that, when we get into the structure of school, which really represents our relationship with our culture, with our society, and we get into a structure, it's difficult to stay in stream of consciousness. We have to somehow work out how to interact in a way that is culturally acceptable and culturally ways of communicating with words and with cultural ways that have been worked out. Tradition comes from things that have been sort of figured out over time. And I think cultures are created in that way. But the problem is that as we create this structure in our minds of that's like something we already know, we create a whole system of thinking that we begin to adhere to as reality. And we forget that this is something that we created. And so this is what we are constantly dealing with between our experience of life as relative, and life as the absolute. Absolute meaning kind of that stream of consciousness way of experiencing life. So Zazen practice helps us to re-experience that. Stella, that's not your cushion. I'm sorry. She sheds, so she's supposed to be over here. It's probably too late, but so it was very interesting. Someone said to me when I was getting rev to start Great Tree, she said, "You don't have any money. How are you going to do this?" And I said, "I don't know, but I have to try." And she said, this is a hard thing. Are you sure you want to do this? You've got the Zen Center and it's working. And why would you want to subject yourself to this thing? Because it's not easy to start something like this. Which, I knew that because at Minnesota Zen Center, I observed trying to start a monastery and all that goes with that. But I remember thinking, but I have to do this because, first of all, I knew that if I was laying on my deathbed and I hadn't tried, that it would be hard for me to die. But also I thought this kind of effort is the kind of thing that we need in life to continue to help us awaken to how we attach the things that Can you hear me? Okay. One time I said to my teacher, Katagiri Roshi, when I came back from Japan, the teacher in Japan had really emphasized letting go of ego and, Kensho experiences. He had a strong Rinzai influence in his younger years. So I came back thinking, talking about ego and talking about how we need to get rid of ego and everything. So one time at a tea, I said to Katagiri Roshi, what is ego? And see, my definition of ego now is that construct that we create in order to function in society, what I was talking about. I saw my nephew creating when he was 6 or 7 years old. And so I said to Katagiri Roshi, what is ego? I stood up, waiting for him to say ego is a terrible thing that we should get. He said, ego is our life force. It's what causes us to survive as humans. And I was like, what? So I've thought about that over the years. And I feel like what he was trying to say is that we have to be able to live in relative reality. We have to be able to function in relative reality or we die. We wouldn't have, when we become adults and leave home, we need to learn how to function by ourselves. We have to learn how to somehow get food, how to, prepare it and eat. And of course, the incentive is survival. But what is driving that is our ego, is that part of us which says, this is how to do it. These are some ways to do it. And it's kind of like a framework that helps us to stay on task. But one big experience that I had when I was at Tassajara is I was sitting one day trying to, how sometimes you're sitting in meditation, you find yourself trying to figure out an answer to a problem. So your mind is kind of thinking about it. And then suddenly you realize that you're kind of overthinking the whole thing. Well, this time I was sitting there trying to answer a problem, and I thought, I came up with a solution. And I immediately dismissed that solution. And I noticed that I did that. And I thought, why did I do that? Why did I dismiss that solution? And I had this vision, this visual picture of myself inside this four-walled concrete thing. What do you call it? Room. And the solution was somewhere outside of that room. And that concrete room was composed of all of my ideas about what life is, and that didn't fit in. I couldn't make it fit in, so I dismissed it. And this is something I think that we do in Zazen. Dogen Zenji says in Bandowa several times, he probably says it in a lot of other places too, but he says, every time that we sit down in meditation, we awaken. And the first time I ever heard that, I was like, yes. I think Roshi said it. But then when I said it one day to a group of students from a local school in Minneapolis, one of the teachers raised her hand and she said, I've done a lot of meditation and I've never awakened. And I said, I don't even know where this came from. I said, well, that's because we are unfamiliar with what the experience of awakening is. So when we have it, if it doesn't fit into what is familiar to us, we immediately dismiss it as not real. So we have to meditate for a long time before we can recognize the reality of that experience of awakening. I'm very interested in the Eightfold Path, particularly in right effort. And right, by the way, is a translation of the word sama. And actually, sama, I don't think right is a good translation. It means something like to unite with, to unify with, to walk with, to harmonize with. So how do we harmonize? What kind of effort is harmonious? What kind of effort do we make that helps us to harmonize with life? And so for years, I have said, right effort is getting myself to the cushion. Because in this practice called shikantaza, or just sitting, when we sit, just sitting, I say shikantaza means resisting the compulsion to do something. Of course, kind of thoughts come up because that's what our mind does. Our mind secretes thoughts. When the thoughts come up, at a certain point, we may notice we're thinking too much. Or at a certain point, we notice, oh, I'm really angry. I'm thinking about this anger. Or we notice, I am very uncomfortable. We notice things about our body. And if we don't get up at that point, that moment of awakening helps us to let go of something that we're adhering to. And we may not even recognize what we're letting go of, because letting go of a lot of things takes time, because we have to unpack it. It's not just a let go and then you're good to go. We have to, because we have habitual ways of thinking that sometimes get in our way. So I think for me, this ego, or this way of adhering to a particular way of seeing reality, is something that we constantly have to really be aware of in order to be free of it, in order to be able to make choices. Otherwise, we're just constantly just letting our ego be in charge without even noticing it. We just react, we just respond in habitual ways. But if we take a moment and take a deep breath and let our body relax, let our body mind relax, we can experience little tiny letting goes. And all of these little tiny letting goes, I think when we recognize that we're thinking too much, when we recognize that we're angry, when we recognize that we're putting tension into our bodies, when we see those things, that moment of seeing is a moment of letting go. Whether we can know that or not, it is letting go. And The difficulty with letting go, though, is that we can't make letting go happen. But just by sitting down and shutting up, which is shikantaza, just sitting, letting go happens. And Dogen Zenji talks about that. He has a phrase called Shinjin Datsuraku, means body and mind. Dropping off body and mind is how it's translated. This is how he describes Zazen. But he also turns that around and says Datsuraku Shinjin, which means body and mind drop away. So to me, what this Shinjin Datsuraku, or dropping off body and mind, and Datsuraku Shinjin, body and mind dropping away, what it's pointing to is we make the effort and then we let go of it. We go in a direction, and Katagiri Roshi was talking about ego. He said, it's important to have a goal. It's important to have a direction. And I don't know whether he said this, but my understanding is that, my experience is that when we hold on to a particular idea of what the result will be, then it becomes a problem, because we can easily get stuck in thinking that it was a failure. So people come to this practice, and of course in this practice, beginner's mind is a very important aspect of our practice. And when you first come to the practice, a lot of people have that experience, because most of us really don't know what's going to happen when we sit down on the cushion. That's a good thing. Don't know mind is a very important aspect of this practice, beginner's mind. But after a while, we start to think that we understand something, or that we should be getting something. And when it doesn't produce in a certain way, well, this is not my thing. Then we go off to something else. Lots of people come and go in this practice. And some people even complain to me that I should be doing more, I should be giving more. I should be inspiring more. And there are teachers out there that can do that. And fortunately now in Asheville, there's lots of people, lots of teachers that provide a lot more entertainment than Soto Zen practice does. This is not a very entertaining kind of practice. So that's good, because people have somewhere to go. I'm very grateful for that. But as for me, through my experiences with Katagiri Roshi, with Tassajara, I was telling somebody this morning, I had a difficult time at Tassajara. I didn't particularly like it. But of course, that I can also say it was probably the best practice I ever did. But one of the great things that happened when I was at Tassajara was, after the second month that I was there, Thich Nhat Hanh came and taught us for 2 weeks. And Thich Nhat Hanh had the same kind of presence as my teacher, Katagiri Roshi. In fact, Thich Nhat Hanh stayed at Minnesota Zen Center, he stayed with the Katagiris when he visited Minnesota. And his Katagiri Roshi's wife told me that being in the room with 2 of them was really an amazing experience, because they had so much of that same kind of presence. And of course, that kind of presence comes from their deep practice. That deep practice that allowed them to understand letting go quickly, in the moment. This is something that I struggled with. When I first went to the monastery in Japan, to Hosshinji, I said to my teacher there, where does anger come from? Because for some reason I had a lot of anger that I was recognizing. And he said, oh, there's no root. I said, what is the root of anger? He said, there's no root. So I said, well, where does it come from? He says, it just comes from circumstances. I said, well, so what do you do about it? And he said, well, recognize it when it first comes up. And I remember thinking, that's impossible. It kind of takes you over, and then you don't even sort of realize where it came from. But I set it as a goal to kind of back up, start to recognize it when it was first coming up. And I must say that I saw a lot of things through that effort, through that practice. And one of the things that I noticed was that what I was doing was I was not recognizing it when it first came up. And if I did recognize it when it first came up, it didn't have the charge over me. It didn't have a hold over me that it did if I just kind of suppressed it in some way. And I think that's kind of a practice of, it's a practice of mindfulness, to be able to learn how to recognize something when it first comes up. Because if we recognize something in this moment, or close to this moment, and recognize kind of how we're thinking about it, habitual ways of thinking, then we're free of the hold that those habitual ways of thinking can have on us, that cause us to act in certain ways, which are maybe not the best ways to bring about harmony. It's not so fixed. Life is not so fixed. The answers are not so clear. The reason I don't like the word right in the Eightfold Path is because right implies, in our culture anyway, the idea that there is a distinct right and a distinct wrong. And this kind of behavior is right, and this kind of behavior is wrong. And actually, that's not always the case. Sometimes in some situations, what is right in one situation is not so good for another situation. It can create disharmony. So when we overlay those kinds of ideas about right, what is right and what is wrong in terms of our behavior, sometimes we create disharmony. So our precepts, are seen as mirrors. Look in the mirror and see what is the appropriate action in this situation. They're kind of pointing to certain ways of behavior that can guide us. But it's not specific. So this practice of letting go has been very front and center for me in the development of Great Tree, because I truly, truly believe that the best way to become free in this practice is to sit down and shut up. And by doing so, to recognize those things that cause us to get stuck and run from one thing to another. This is basic dukkha. Dukkha in Buddhism is the first noble truth. And I always say, it's suffering, but it's translated as suffering, but it's a particular kind of, well, not a particular kind of suffering, a big kind of suffering, a broad kind of suffering that really is that feeling of dissatisfaction, which constantly comes up in us. I'm not good enough. I have to, if I do this, my life will be better. If I do this, my life will be better. And then we do it, and our life is not better in the way that we imagined it. And so we can't see in what way it made our life better. We just run off to the next thing. And that chasing after is the experience of suffering that we experience in the First Noble Truth. And the reason that we suffer in that way is because we want something to hold on to. Human life is very ungrounded. And what lies in wait for us at the end is death, which we don't know what it is. We can say whatever we want, but that moment of death, I'm convinced, there's just this kind of wall that we create. We can't see what's on the other side. But in Buddhism, life and death are not different. They're just kind of, we get recycled, right? Our energy gets recycled. That we are already part of something called life. And our human body is just some of the energy of life coming together in a particular way, in a solid way. And death is just the dissipation of that energy. Like taking a glass of water, or taking a glass and scooping some water out of the ocean. And it has a form when it's in that glass. You might call that human life. And you pour it back into the ocean, and you might call that death, but it's the same water. It just had a form for a while, and then it gets back into the ocean of life. So I think Great Tree has taught me, first of all, the value of faith, which is don't know mind. Faith is the thing that it's kind of what we can return to when our overthinking isn't working. Thinking is, of course, valuable for us in life, but overthinking can be detrimental to our health. And causes us to miss those opportunities to allow ourselves to fully experience what life is. So sitting down and shutting up is really very boring. Katagiri Roshi used to say, you have to become very boring in order to do this practice. He might have had his tenses mixed up. He might have meant to say, you have to become very bored in order to do this practice. But I found that I've also become very boring. You know, I'm not as exciting as a lot of people would like. But that lack of excitement, that lack of striving for excitement, creates a kind of a quietness. My name, Teijo, means right stillness. And I often say that's because I'm such a quiet person. which is really a joke. And I thought that when I first got that name, Katagiri Roshi gave me that name, I thought it was a joke because one of the biggest complaints about me at Minnesota Zen Center was when people sat next to me, I wiggled a lot. And I think a lot of the reason I wiggled, I still wiggle a lot, but I think a lot of the reason was because at that time I was studying a lot of dance. And so I could feel every muscle in my body. And so when something was a little off, I felt I needed to make an adjustment. Like now. But he looked at me at our precept ceremony when I received that name. And I was in a big quandary about why would he give me this name? And oh, maybe he's trying to point to something. And he walked up to me and he said, "Do you like your name?" And I knew that for him, there was something much deeper there than you wiggle a lot, so you should learn it. It wasn't, I don't think it was that. I think what he saw in me was that I knew how to find that still point. I knew how to do that. And even though I squirmed a lot on the cushion, there were those moments when I could touch that stillness. Because I touched it when I was 3 years old in church, sitting next to my mother. Which is one of the reasons why we have family meditation at Great Tree. I am so appreciative to my mother, my first teacher, for sharing that stillness with me and allowing me to, giving me something to return to. Katagiri Roshi's first book was called Returning to Silence. And I always say, the center of the cyclone is very still. So I don't know if that gives you the history of Great Tree, but that's my understanding of the history. So what is happening right now has been heavily influenced by quarantine, which was a reset for us because the first several years of Great Tree were working on paying the mortgage. When we got the mortgage paid off, I felt a lot of stress leaving my body. And I thought, what's the next step? Now, also, there was a lot of getting things up and running at Great Tree. In the first 10 years, first 15 years, we had more than 25 residents. And by residents, I mean people who stayed for 2 months or more. Chimio stayed here for 10 years. And we did a really intense practice. When quarantine came along, I was tired. I was exhausted. And I'm getting older. So I thought, now what? What's next? What's the next possibility? And I realized that I was in the third stage of what Iyengar, because Iyengar talks about as the 4 stages of life. He said the first stage is when you're being taken care of. And it's just kind of a exploring life kind of stage. The next stage is when you take care of yourself, your professional life or your family life. And then the third, and that's longer. And the third stage is letting go of what you've created. And the fourth stage is dying. So during quarantine, I was I was with the question, I had been with the question for a few years of how do I let go of what I've created? What is this transition? What does it mean? How do I let go? In my family, people live quite a long time, so I'm expecting to die at about 97, which is about 20 years from now. And so I feel like I've got a little time to work this out. And it's just not about what's a transition for me, it's about what's a transition for Great Tree. And I can't tell you how many people have said to me, you need a succession plan. Well, my succession plan is very much based on faith. I finally realized that I haven't seen any succession plan in the Zen world that works. It's a kind of a system that's based on a teacher that does something and is the kind of the one that kind of keeps it going until that teacher dies and then a new teacher, or until that teacher can't do it anymore because they have dementia or Alzheimer's, and then the new one takes over. This is kind of the way that it's been designed. But I have a different idea. I have the Catholic idea. I was in the Benedictines, and then in the Benedictines, Saint Benedict he is known as the founder of Western monasticism. And his idea that the master-disciple thing didn't work so well. And so he created a sort of democratic system where you vote for that prioress or the prior. The whole community votes. And it changes every 6 years. And also you vote for a council. I can't remember, but I think it's 10 people. And the council and the prioress work together. And so then I was back to the convent last year. Yeah, last year I was back, and I've been back a couple times in recent years. And they were just getting a new prioress. They had just voted a new prioress. So I watched the installation on streaming. Zoom is another great thing. Streaming. And I thought, this is how the transition can work. After the mountain seat ceremony in a year, which is basically an installation, as I said, Shinzanshiki. For the next 6 years after that, I will put the energy out there to bring to Great Tree someone who understands deeply the spirit of this practice and can carry it on in their way. So I told the board, in order to do that, probably I need to get out of this building because I have too dominant a personality. And one of the things they do in the convent is, where I was, is the abbess, that's the outgoing abbess, prioress, leaves for a period of time in order to let the new abbess take over, so that there's not a feeling of, a conflict of style, so to speak. And I mean, looking at just the prioresses that I've known over the years, and even the current ones, everyone has their own style. And everyone has a different thing to bring to it. But it's all so beautiful and beneficial. So that's the plan. That's the succession plan. And it's based a lot on faith. And the funny thing about faith, my first big experience of this in terms of Great Tree was a year and a half in. We had raised $160,000 or something like that. And this was done a lot because of the energy of the person that had spearheaded it and become the president and put together a board. And she's amazing, but she wasn't used to doing things that she did in groups. She was used to succeeding in things on her own. And doing things with a group slows it down a lot and is very frustrating. And when you're putting something together, like all the pieces of trying to make something like this happen, it's just so much work. And so she completely burned out. And with her went 3 of the 5 board members. And so I had this big experience of kind of sinking like into quicksand. And I thought, should I just give this up? Because this is not working. And then I thought, well, it's either sink into the quicksand or take the next step. Take another step until it absolutely doesn't work, so that when I'm laying on my deathbed, I can say, well, I tried, but it didn't work. And I tried all the way until it didn't work. So I did my best, and sorry, So I decided I was going to just take the next step. And deep down inside of me, I had this feeling that all I have to do is really work on my own practice, kind of get my own shit together, and that's all I have to do. Because I realized that my teacher's greatest teaching was his practice. It wasn't what he told us. It wasn't what he thought we should do. It was just his great effort to do the practice himself. And he didn't think he was so great. He was always, Japanese people, when they talk about themselves, they point to their nose. He used to say, this stupid guy. And I used to think, oh, he's so humble. But now I understand it's not humility. It's the reality. But I thought, if I can just get my own practice on course, this will work. But that recognition of my own inadequacy was a real obstacle to my faith. So I knew I just needed to focus on that deeper faith. And I just knew that when circumstances were right, that it would all work out. And of course, then someone came along, and there's just lots of people that have created Great Tree. People give me a lot of credit for it, but if I told you how many people, I can just look around this room and look at all the people that contributed to the things in this meditation hall. And if I just started to list all of the people that helped us along the way in various ways, including Zen Center of Asheville, the folks at Zen Center of Asheville, it really is really a bigger Sangha here. But one of the things that I realized in this whole thing is that patience is learning how to let life unfold. So that's, to me, that's what the future of Great Tree is. Just letting life unfold without adhering to some idea of what it should be, or what it could be, or even what it is. So I think I've talked too long. Sorry. But that's what I have to say.